gave you that foundation around the threats of mass violence and really kind of set up the scene for our threat assessment conversation and our MDR conversation this afternoon. Where we really want to go is we want to look at the intersection of those threat assessments and your processes and procedural obligations under manifestation determination reviews. How do they overlap? How do they intersect? Please note that this is not teaching you how to conduct a threat assessment. We really want to ensure that you are leaning into your district policies and procedures on how to conduct threat assessments. I hope that you have been in collaboration with your directors of school, your safety coordinator, even your special education director, as you guys think through building out your policies and procedures around threat assessments for both general education students and special education students. At the end of this presentation, I do have some resources that I would like to share with you. I had the opportunity a few weeks ago to attend a national conference, and I was able to attend several sessions around threat assessment with some of our national experts in this area. And so they, through just attending that training, were able to share a few documents that you're going to hear me reference throughout this, one of which is a special education checklist. So it allows your team to use as a supplement document alongside your threat assessment documents to look at the areas and components that we should be considering when we're conducting a threat assessment for a student with a disability. Another one of the documents is a parent notification form that you may use in your districts as you're thinking about notifying parents around threat assessments and those threats of mass violence, and really ensuring that parents are given the opportunity to be collaborative partners in this process if they would like to be. None of these documents have been vetted by the TDOE, so please, if you are going to utilize these documents that I'll provide you in the chat, please have those vetted by your local board's attorney, your director of schools, to make sure that these are documents that you wish and that align to your policies and procedures and that you wish to use through these processes. I cannot see the chat, so if there are any questions, feel free. We can, Susan, feel free to pop in as we go through this training and let me know if there are any questions, okay? Well, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks, Susan. This is our agenda. As I mentioned, we're going to ground ourselves in talking about those interim alternative educational settings, those special circumstances. I think, again, Taylor set us up perfectly this morning for this. We're going to dive into those threats of mass violence and those definitions of what that entails. We're going to talk about the general education process for threats, as well as the special education process for threats. And then we're going to compare and contrast both of those processes. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some other considerations as you're thinking about those threats of mass violence in your school buildings. Okay, so let's ground ourselves in, and this I think is probably the same exact slide you may have seen this morning. But let's remember, if a student commits with a disability commits an offense that is defined as a special circumstance under IDEA, that federal law, we can remand that student in that that interim alternative educational setting for up to 45 days, regardless of if it is or is not a manifestation, right? We have that luxury to say, even if this is a manifestation of the child's disability, we have 45 school days. Now, the problem comes with these threats of mass violence because they are considered to be zero tolerance offenses under state law. So if a student with a disability commits an offense that constitutes that zero tolerance offense as defined under state law or your local board policy, but it does not meet that threshold for special circumstance under IDEA, we cannot remand that child to that interim alternative educational setting unless both the parent and the teachers and the team agree to that change of placement, which we'll talk about in a second. So keep in mind, as we see here on these slides, these are defined differently, as Taylor mentioned this morning. And threats of mass violence would not constitute a special circumstance under IDEA unless there was some overlap under those special circumstances where potentially the child was in possession of a weapon as they were potentially making this threat of mass violence. So let me give you a real life example. So about 4 or 5 weeks ago, we had a parent reach out to the department and their child had made a threat of mass violence. The team had conducted a threat assessment. They had initiated that manifestation determination review. The team determined that the threat was valid and credible, but the MDR indicated that it was a manifestation of that child's disability. The child had severe psychopathic behaviors, a lot of psychopathy. This child was in and out of residential facilities, and they said yes. The child's defined eligibility with emotional disturbance, it was a manifestation of their disability. On the bottom of their MDR form, they said, well, even though it's a manifestation, this is a zero tolerance offense under state law. And they said, we're remanding the child to the alternative school for 180 school days. Can they do that? No. The parent and the team did not agree to a change of placement. And because it was a manifestation, even though the threat was deemed to be valid and credible, we are returning that child from the placement from which they were removed. Okay, so let's talk about what that means in context of our threat assessment process. And then we'll talk at the end of this presentation around some alternatives or some options that districts have if that situation does arise, as I just described. Okay, remember, state law does not trump federal law. So in this case, even though threats of mass violence are considered zero tolerance under state law, if it is determined to be a manifestation, we are returning that child from the placement from which they were removed unless the team and the parent agree to that change of placement. Let's talk about threats of mass violence. So we know as defined that a student has committed that zero tolerance offense if they make a threat of mass violence on school property or at a school related event. And so that second bullet here is really where your threat assessment process comes into play. In order to determine, right, if mass violence means any act which a reasonable person could conclude could lead to serious bodily injury or death of two or more persons, this is the process of your threat assessment. So how are we going to determine if the mass violence threat was a credible and valid threat that could lead any reasonable person to conclude that there will be serious bodily injury or death of two or more persons? As we were doing these presentations over the state over the last few weeks, there were a lot of people that chimed in here and said, April, we take every threat of mass violence as being valid and credible until the process tells us it's not. And I don't disagree with that. I think we need to take every threat as a serious threat until our process plays out. I would also encourage you not to treat students differently in this process. If you have a student with maybe a severe cognitive disability and you know that because of his severe cognitive disability, oh, he's just joking, he doesn't mean that. Or maybe a student with autism has a lot of echolalic tendencies where they repeat things that they heard on television, movies, or video games, and you know, oh, she doesn't mean that. She's just repeating what she heard. I would always encourage you to follow your processes as you would with any other student and not treat our students any differently just because of their disability. Follow the processes and cover your bases as required within the threat assessment processes. So threats of mass violence. We know that public chapter was amended related to threats of mass violence last year, where any student who threatens mass violence, they must undergo that threat assessment. So who makes up your threat assessment teams in your district? Who is leading that process? We have found over doing these trainings over the state the last few weeks, you guys really need to have a good, strong understanding of what template or curriculum or model of threat assessment your school district is utilizing. We have seen that many of our district admins sometimes don't know what the threat assessment processes are. I would encourage you to ask questions of your district leadership to know what those are, and then any other additional trainings that you may be able to be a part of. One of the leaders in threat assessment is the National Center for Threat Assessment, NCAT. And that is essentially our U.S. Secret Service has put together a threat assessment protocol. And there's several different modules and free trainings that you and your teams can access through that NCAT website. And there's also templates and protocols. I would certainly lean into that resource or any other resource that your districts have worked with. Our Safe Tennessee website, which I'll have a link at the end of this presentation, also has a lot of trainings around threat assessment embedded into into that website, which again, I'll share with you at the end of this. I will say through the trainings that I went to when I was at the national conference, one of the leaders in threat assessment, she's often called as to testify as an expert witness in cases. Her name is Dr. Melissa Reeves, and some of her feedback or her recommendations to districts sat really kind of harshly with me, because I was sitting there thinking, goodness, do our districts have some of these things into place, right? One of her recommendations was not to piecemeal threat assessment together, to take a little bit of this, a little bit of this, and a little bit of this, is really to stick with one protocol, one curriculum, and then to make sure all of the necessary players have been trained on that. And then document how you've trained, who you've trained, and when you've trained. What you don't want to have happen is if any type of, dispute resolution lawsuit is filed on the basis of the outcome of your threat assessment, that when you're having to testify or discuss this, you really don't have a strong understanding of the underpinning of what that threat assessment process is, and then you don't have any documentation of how your teams were trained and to what extent they were trained. So again, as we think about the students who must undergo this threat assessment to determine if it is a valid and credible threat, know that the child may be suspended until the threat assessment is complete. And I think before I was able to go through some of these additional trainings, I would have said, absolutely. I think it's maybe always in our best interest to consider if suspension is necessary. But I do want to caution you administrators on this call. So when we think about the pathway to violence, if we think about a road from the initial injustice, grievance, or perceived injustice, that is what starts a person on the pathway to violence that would lead them to commit an act of mass violence. So it always starts with, again, a grievance, an injustice, or a perceived injustice. So maybe the teacher gave me an F because they don't like me. The soccer team doesn't allow me to play on the varsity because I'm just too good, right? Or this boy or girl broke up with me, and I can't believe that they would do this to me. So whether it is based in reality or in fiction, it starts them on that pathway to violence. And so let's say the grievance, injustice, or perceived injustice has occurred. So the student is on that pathway to violence. If we suspend them during this time, could we possibly be adding some fuel to the flame that may only spur them further down that pathway to violence? So I'm not saying that we shouldn't suspend students during this process, but I want you to take it on a case-by-case basis, knowing that by suspending them through this process, you may be inadvertently pushing them down that pathway to violence. But I will also caution you here, the most important person that we need to have access to during the threat assessment is the student. And if they're at home or in another setting during that time, we may lose some really critical access that we need to gain insight into their thinking and where they are on that pathway. We also may be losing opportunities to intervene proactively if they are not in our school building. So keep in mind, when we think of suspension, we often think of going home. Could we suspend, but in a manner that would allow us to still have access, whether that's through our ISS programs, some type of behavioral classroom or reset room? Where else could we still have access and supervision of the student, but still have what we need to complete the threat assessment process, and to do so in a manner that's going to give us the information that we need? Now, keep in mind, if the threat is not a valid or credible threat, then they can't be expelled for committing that zero tolerance, but they still may be suspended pursuant to your code of conduct. So keep in mind that scenario I told you, that real life scenario, they said, well, no, it is a manifestation, even though it is, and they deemed it a valid and credible threat. The state law, again, cannot supersede federal law. So we have to make sure, as we're thinking about our timelines, that we are communicating both across our special education staff and our directors in our special education programs, and then you as administrators making sure you're communicating with those teams to complete whatever procedural requirements that would be required during this time. Let's look at what this process looks like for general education students. I think you guys could probably kind of envision this in your head, but threat of mass violence occurs. You're going to complete your threat assessment. You know, as we just talked about, that you may suspend during this time, and then you're going to suspend or expel based on the outcome of that. Pretty cut and dry, right? Let's look at the difference between this general education process and one for a special education student. So we know threat of mass violence occurs. We're going to complete that threat assessment. We got some questions over the last few weeks that said, April, should we complete the MDR first or the threat assessment first? And I thought it was a great question. Keep in mind that if you complete your threat assessment for a student with a disability and it's not a valid or credible threat, you may not have to hold the MDR, right? You may not get to the 10 days or exceed those 10 days where you would need to hold the MDR. So we would encourage you to complete the threat assessment process first, and then if necessary, complete that MDR. Now, could these processes be happening concurrently just in anticipation that you may need to hold the MDR? Because you're going to see in the subsequent slides, a lot of the data that you're gleaning from your threat assessment, you may also be able to use during your MDR and vice versa. So yeah, these processes may be happening where you're collecting the data that you need to justify the completion of your threat assessment as well as your MDR. But I would really encourage you that these processes should be separate, meaning that the meeting should not be held at the exact same time. The meeting's contents are going to be different. The participants are going to be different. The outcomes are going to be different. And then the documentation of these meetings are going to be different, which we're going to talk about more in a second. So you're going to complete that threat assessment. If you need to, you're going to hold that manifestation. Keep in mind, procedurally, you must hold an MDR within 10 days of the decision to change the student's placement. So this is where our special education team and our general education team and you as administrators really need to have clear, open lines of communication. If the threat assessment process is taking too long, and then we're starting to inch up towards those 10 days, we may have some struggle there, right? So we need to make sure that we're, especially for our students with disabilities, that our threat assessment process is completed in a good, reasonable time frame in order to be able to hold that MDR within a reasonable time frame as well. And then at the outcome of that, notice it's going to say suspend, expel, or neither. So if it is a manifestation of that child's disability, we may not be able to penalize them. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a moment. But that doesn't mean that we can't implement proactive preventative approaches for these students to ensure that we are keeping them and other students and faculty safe in our school buildings. You'll notice at the top that it says you may need to consider providing special education services over the course of the duration of this. Let's say you have a student who's already been suspended or expelled in excess of 10 days that school year. They make a threat of mass violence. You may have to consider providing special education services from the time you start that threat assessment process, especially if you're determining that you're going to suspend or expel, meaning that you're going to change their placement, right? From the time to that MDR is complete. So always keeping in mind, these are going to be on case-by-case scenarios depending on that student's previous disciplinary actions in their file, and then determining how you're going to treat each of these students moving forward. But again, that collaboration between the special education and the general education teams and departments is going to be vital here. It's going to be vital. As it mentions here, just knowing that a student with a disability made a threat assessment and is removed from school, you must ensure that that child continues to receive access to FAPE, which we're going to talk about more in a moment, okay? So let's look at this scenario. Chloe is a 9th grade student with an emotional disturbance. During math class, her teacher hands out grades from the latest math test. Chloe sees that she got an F on the test and mutters, "I'm going to burn this school down so I never have to take another math test." What would you do next? And then what are your obligations if Chloe is suspended for more than 10 days? I know I've been alluding to our trainings we've done over the last few weeks, and I'm going to do that again. But somebody a couple weeks ago said, April, if they have an emotional disturbance, then I would say, yes, that is a valid and credible threat. I just want to caution you to make any type of assumptions or predeterminations around a specific eligibility area. Many of you on this call have been in meetings for students with emotional disturbance, and none of those students have ever made, a threat of mass violence. The symptomatology of how students present across some of our eligibility categories are vast, right? And we know under emotional disturbance, there are 5 sub-criteria that students may meet, and any one of those criteria may satisfy the eligibility around emotional disturbance. So if a student maybe had an inability to maintain or build interpersonal relationships, and that's how she qualified for emotional disturbance, then you may not see any connection to stating that they want to burn the school down after receiving an F. But maybe Chloe qualified under emotional disturbance because she had atypical or abnormal responses to normal stimuli, right? And in this case, she got an F on a math test, so we could probably even argue that's maybe not normal stimuli. But in this case, what's your first step? I hope all of you on this call are saying, well, April, I'm going to hold a threat assessment. Yes, that should be your next first step. So what types of data are you going to review for Chloe through that threat assessment process? I would hope that you're going to get some statements from teachers, from other faculty and staff. Has Chloe made these types of comments before? I hope you're going to go back and look at her disciplinary records and go back to her evaluations, reevaluations to determine if she speaks in this very hyperbolic tone where she just goes to the end of the world type of thing when something doesn't go her way. And then really dig into her IEP, her services. Is she receiving any type of counseling, social emotional support, behavioral support, or does she actually have some really marked deficits in math? And she has very normal frustrations when she doesn't perform well. All of these pieces of evidence are going to be imperative. Would some of you maybe talk to Chloe's friends? Perhaps. It depends on if you think you need to go down that route or not. Every case is going to be looked at and treated somewhat uniquely in terms of the data you need to collect and where you need to go. Others would say, hey, we need to look at her social media. Has she made these types of threats before? Does she have any grievances or issues on social media? You absolutely can pursue that option as well. Your team, your threat assessment team needs to determine what types of data you need to review in order to be able to work through your entire threat assessment process. And then if Chloe is suspended for more than 10 days, then we're going to be talking about how we can provide her special education services as this process plays out until we get to our conclusion of both our threat assessment and our MDR to ensure that she is provided FAPE. I will say too, we always need to make sure when we think about threat assessments, especially when we think about certain eligibility categories or whatnot, that threat assessment is not profiling. Okay, it's not profiling. Oh, well, Chloe wears, a dark hoodie and she wears dark makeup and, black lipstick and she's really withdrawn and isolated. We're not profiling. We're looking at a series of behaviors. And that's really what's different here about threat assessment. We have to have some actionable pieces of evidence to support the threat assessment process. And we can't base that on stereotypes, biases, or assumptions that we're making about any of our students. So let's dig into the commonalities and differences between threat assessment and manifestation determination reviews. So as I mentioned before, should they occur concurrently? Should they be happening at the same time? Possibly. Look at 2 of these cases here. One where a district could not expel a student whose remarks indicated he was going to shoot up the school because the student's misconduct was a manifestation of his disability. And this is really just highlighting the importance of ensuring that procedurally you're following your steps for our students with disabilities. The second case here is somewhat similar, finding that a Missouri district improperly expelled a student with an emotional disturbance without appropriately considering whether her threat to attack the school was a manifestation. So again, just because it is a manifestation doesn't essentially supersede what our state law requires. And then don't forget to hold your MDR. That critical procedural piece and obligation for our districts is huge. And that's where we don't want to open yourselves up to dispute resolution by forgetting to hold that MDR when you need to hold the MDR. So what is it? admin on the call. I'm assuming you've been in a manifestation determination review at some point in your tenure as an administrator. Essentially, it is defined as an evaluation of the student's misconduct to determine whether the misconduct had a direct or substantial relationship to the child's disability, or the second prong of that, was it your failure to implement the child's IEP that caused that misconduct? And we must do that MDR prior to that change of placement for students with this disability. Administrators on the call, if you've never been through any of our MDR trainings, please feel free to reach out to me or to Taylor Jenkins. We have a short abbreviated training that has been recorded around MDR that we can send you, as well as our slide deck. We would really encourage you to watch it, as again, as the LEAs in your buildings, you need to have a strong understanding of MDR processes. We call it MDR and define it as an evaluation because that's what it should be. You're evaluating all of your evidence to determine if that misconduct had that direct or substantial relationship to the child's disability. And in order to do that, we really caution you to rush the process. I know administrators sometimes we say, okay, the child had this code of conduct violation. We want to get to MDR as soon as we can. And not that that's wrong, but we need to collect the evidence that we need in order to make a good database decision in that MDR process. And sometimes we need more than 24 hours to collect that data, okay? So what is a threat assessment? The primary purpose of that threat assessment is to identify and then prevent any targeted violence. So there's a three-pronged approach here. We're going to identify, assess, and manage. And I think where we typically do okay on is we are able to identify, but administrators, how are we managing those students? So often we see, okay, a child made a threat of mass violence. We're going to remand them to the alternative school for 180 days. And then in 181 days, they come back and poof, we have nothing in place for these children. We need to make sure that we are managing them in the same manner and respect that we would for any student who has an academic or behavioral concern, meaning that maybe we're going to set up some progress monitoring. What goals and objectives potentially do we want this child to meet? What supports preventatively can we put into place in that alternative setting to prepare them to transition back to our school and to transition back in a manner that is going to really ensure their success, but then prevent the probability or the likelihood that another threat of mass violence will occur. So when we think about what your threat assessment should include, if you are envisioning what your protocol looks like, it should include these kind of three buckets, right? Intent, capability, opportunity, or means. And those are the questions that you should be asking in your threat assessment process. We'll get to some additional questions in a moment. But does the child have an intent to harm themselves or others? Is there capability? And do they have opportunity or means? So when we think about threat assessment, as I alluded to before, parents are also critical members that could be included in this process. But I will say often maybe our parents are in somewhat of denial that their child would have said something to this manner or have these thoughts or these intentions, and maybe they're not willing to be collaborative partners. We would encourage you to continue to complete your threat assessment, but the opportunity and means, that is really important for you to loop parents in on. Do they have access to weapons? Do they have access to funds to purchase any necessary equipment or tools to be able to complete this threat of mass violence? That's where we really would hope that parents would be collaborative partners. And then that parent notification letter I alluded to before would assist you in explaining why it is so critical for them to be collaborative partners in this. Who is on your MDR team? Well, you'll notice here that required team members are parents, representatives from the LEA, which would probably be you, and other relevant members of the student's IEP team as determined by both the parent and the LEA. So this could be the school psychologist, this could be your speech language pathologist, OT, PT, it could be your school nurse, it could be general education teachers, special education teachers. It is typically your right to have the members that you need at that table to help make and answer those questions. Principals, I would always encourage you that if you're speaking about a certain eligibility category, have that assessment specialist at the table to speak to that. We want to make sure that we're not kind of fumbling through the process. And if the parents or if their advocates have a question about how this eligibility manifests and the symptomatology of that, make sure you have the players at the table to speak to that during those meetings. As that second bullet notes, parents do not have the right to uninvite team members. They certainly can invite additional participants, such as advocates, attorneys, but they cannot uninvite team members to an MDR. And again, parents are required team members. We would always encourage you to document your invitation in TN Pulse that you did invite them to participate. So how does this contrast with threat assessment team? Notice that parents are not required team members. I certainly would encourage you to loop them into this process, but they are not required team members. In fact, somebody asked me this past week, is parental consent required to conduct a threat assessment? And no, parental consent is not required to conduct a threat assessment. You'll see here that both law enforcement and local education agency personnel must be included. And so it will be at your discretion who is involved with that. But note that threat assessments in a similar fashion as MDR should be a multidisciplinary team. It should not just be one player in your school building that is making the determination that it was a valid and credible threat. It should always be a team. And so keep in mind, this may include your SROs, or if you don't have an SRO, maybe some other local law enforcement. And then as you'll note below, that other LEA personnel may include, as you'll see here, certainly around those students with disabilities, we would strongly encourage you that you have somebody from the special education side of things, whether that's the case manager, the school psych, somebody else that can speak to those eligibility areas to be a part of this. Often we notice that there could be a disconnect between our law enforcement and our special education staff, where sometimes our law enforcement folks don't understand how emotional disturbance or autism or intellectual disability manifests and presents itself. And we really want to ensure that we have the necessary players at the table to educate all of our multidisciplinary team as we complete this threat assessment. So what are we answering at the end of that MDR? Well, as I mentioned before, these two questions. Was the child's threat of mass violence caused by or have a direct or substantial relationship to the child's disability? Or was their behavior a direct result of the LEA's failure to implement the IEP? What are the questions we're asking at the threat assessment? So at a high 35,000 level view here, our threat assessment guiding questions should include, did they communicate a threat or engage in that threatening behavior? Is their intent to harm? And who, again, is going to be one of the best people to be able to glean this information from? It's from the student in question, right? And having those folks to have those, whoever has, if there's anybody in your building who has a strong relationship with that child, to be able to go through interview protocols, to be able to talk with them at length, or obtaining a release of information to talk with any outside providers that they may have, certainly is in your best interest. Is that threat legitimate and serious? Is there capability behind that threat? And how do we know that? It should not, and a threat assessment outcome should never be based on one piece of data. There should be multiple pieces of data, that preponderance of evidence to help guide our threat assessment teams to determine if it was a valid and credible threat. Is that threat an expression of humor, rhetoric, anger, frustration? Is there no intent to harm? And we know some of our students, especially those that do have some really strong psychopathy within their profile, they may be able to say, oh no, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it. What other data do you have to support that that is actually true? Do we have other statements? Have they retracted? Have they shown a level of empathy that we would expect from somebody that would say, no, I would never do that. I'm so sorry, right? What do we have to help justify and to work through some of these guiding questions with our throughout our threat assessment process? Okay. So what data are we going to consider? Well, through that MDR process, we're going to say, hey, We're going to look at and collect data to determine that relationship between the disability and the misconduct. So we're first going to look at, obviously, the behavior prompting that, which was the threat of mass violence. But do we have incident reports? Do we have statements from students, peers, and faculty? Do we have the precipitating events? Maybe something started on social media and then trickled over into the school building. Does the student understand the impact and consequences? Do you have students sign your code of conduct? Do you have clear language within your student code of conduct, your handbooks around threats of mass violence? If you don't, I would strongly encourage that you do. Did they express that that conduct was wrong? Did they understand right and wrong in that moment? Do they have the ability to control behavior? Do you have evidence that they've done this in the past? What is the evidence of their disability? A lot of folks would say, April, we have a lot of students with other health impairment who have ADHD. Well, a lot of parents or advocates may argue that the threat of mass violence was impulsive. Well, go back to that medical documentation from their original evaluation. What subtype of ADHD was noted? Was it the inattentive type? Was it the hyperactive type? Was it the combined type? That's going to give you really rich information. Do you have any other evidence that they are impulsive? When we think about impulsivity, typically it's going to be across settings, right? It's not just going to be at one isolated incident. It's going to be reoccurring. Do you have evidence of that? And what does that look like for your teams to consider? Then we're going to dig into their program and their plan. Do they have a functional behavioral assessment? Do they have a behavior intervention plan? What is the other medical information that's been provided? Are they the current services working? Is the IEP the same year after year after year because they're not making progress? That should tell you that something's not working for that student. And then that puts that responsibility back on your shoulders to change something about that, right? So when we think about threat assessment, you're going to see a lot of overlap in this information. You're going to look at previous threats. You're going to look at disciplinary records. You may look at, if you have a release of information, those outside agency reports. You're going to potentially interview faculty and staff and others, looking at review of that social media, any other witness statements you have, special education records. Really, it could be a lot of the same information. So your threat assessment team may collect all this really rich information, and then if you do have to hold an MDR, they may hand off a lot of this information to your MDR team, right? Keep in mind, you saw that the threat assessment team looks very different than it does for your MDR team, making that all the right, sure that all the right players are there, even though the information may overlap, that you're able to hand off and collaborate with those two parties, okay? Possible outcomes. So if we say yes to either question, yes, the student's threat of mass violence had a direct or substantial relationship to the child's disability, or yes, it was your failure to implement the IEP, then it is a manifestation of the child's disability, okay? Then it is a manifestation. If you say no to both, no, it had not, there was no direct substantial relationship to the child's disability. No, it was not your failure to implement the child's IEP, then it is not a manifestation. So what can we do in these situations? If it is a manifestation of the child's disability, because it was your failure to implement the student's IEP, then you must take immediate steps to remedy those. Folks, we have to acknowledge that we have a lot of shortages, staffing shortages across our state, and we need to be transparent and upfront about that to the greatest extent possible. And so if the child's IEP stated that they should have X, Y, and Z service, and you haven't had that position filled since school started, then more than likely you may have to acknowledge that it was your failure to implement the child's IEP. So really having a strong and maybe potentially difficult conversations during that MDR, but also if you know that you are lacking the ability to execute the child's IEP, creating a plan and proactively discussing with the parents how you may not be able to do this now, but this is how you're going to remediate and mitigate this as much as possible. And here's how and what we're going to do once we are able to remedy this. If it is a manifestation, you're returning that child to the placement from which they were removed, unless, and I alluded to this earlier, unless the parent and the school agree to a change of placement. Now, somebody asked me this past week, April, what does that conversation look like? Well, folks, really talking with our parents to say, what is your goal for your child? And in talking with the families that I was alluding to before, where the child made a threat of mass violence, they determined that it was a valid and credible threat. However, it was a manifestation of the child's many psychiatric disabilities. Was what's your goal? And the parent's goal was, I want my child to graduate. The child is a senior. They want the child to graduate. Well, let's talk about what placement we could potentially agree upon that may not be that current school of zone that is going to set your child up for success to get them where your goals are. And ultimately, the parent and the school agree to a change of placement in educational homebound to be able to provide that student FAPE and get that child to the goal of walking across that stage. Okay. So remember, you may, if it is a manifestation, you have to return them unless the parent and the school agree to that change of placement. If it is a manifestation, you are conducting a functional behavioral assessment and implementing a BIP. This is the only place in federal law that it explicitly requires a team to conduct an FBA, a BIP, outside of what our state board rule requires. But this under federal law says if it is a manifestation, you are conducting that FBA, BIP. Now, many of you on this call as administrators, you're probably thinking, April, how do I conduct an FBA for a threat of mass violence? It may look and feel very different than a traditional FBA BIP, but please conduct the FBA BIP. Remember, you must have parental consent to do so. But the BIP may be including some preventative strategies. Maybe you're going to implement some social skills training. Maybe you're going to implement some other types of replacement behavior. So when the student gets really frustrated, they don't go to saying that they're going to hurt somebody themselves or hurt somebody else. Maybe you're going to work on some sentence starters with them to give them different language. Maybe you're again going to do some additional social emotional curriculum with them to help them regulate their emotions. This may look very different than a traditional FBA BIP process, but I encourage you to implement what you need to. And that may include safety and crisis plans. So when they're entering your building, maybe you're going to have some additional safeguards in place for the student when they return, right? If it's not a manifestation, then you may apply the same disciplinary practices in the same manner for the same duration that you would for any other child that's not a child with a disability. Now, here's the carve out. Now you're having to figure out, what does FAPE look like in that setting? So if the child's threat assessment comes back that it's valid and credible, you say it's not a manifestation of their disability, then you're able to suspend, expel as you would based on your board policies. And then let's say that is in the school's alternative school. What services does the child need in order to continue to participate in general education curriculum and make progress towards those students' IEP goals? Okay. And I would document what this looks like within a prior written notice. So you'll notice here that MDRs can be appealed by children's parents, and it's called an expedited due process hearing. Are threat assessments, can threat assessments be appealed? No, the outcomes of the threat assessments themselves cannot be appealed. However, the disciplinary consequences, right, that you implement with that child can be appealed through your discipline hearing board or whatever you call it in your district. So the threat assessment outcome itself can't be appealed, but whatever you guys implement after the outcome of that threat assessment can be appealed. Okay. In our last few minutes, let's look at some additional considerations. Child find and threat assessments. Administrators, I can't stress enough, if you have a general education student that has made a threat of mass violence or maybe multiple threats, you may be on the hook to fulfill your child fine obligations and evaluate either under Section 504 or under IDEA. And keep in mind, as some of the bullets mentioned, this is especially true if you're saying we have a lot of needs and the child needs a lot of mental health supports, they need some additional counseling, maybe they have a really robust safety crisis plan. I would really strongly consider that you're initiating your child fine obligations under 504 or IDA for any students that you, again, suspect a disability for. Now, I alluded to this at the very beginning of, I think I probably should have put this slide way earlier here, but you know under IDA that you may remove that student to that interim alternative educational setting for up to 45 days for weapons, drugs, or serious bodily injury, even if it is a manifestation. However, so let's go back to my original example. Threat assessment was deemed to be valid and credible, but it was a manifestation. Well, April, you said I don't have 45 days. You would have 45 days if your school district decided to file an expedited due process hearing to seek that child's removal to that interim alternative educational setting. It's called a HONIG injunction. We would strongly encourage you that if, as you're thinking through your processes and you have found that the threat assessment was valid and credible, but it was a manifestation, talk to your local board's attorney about initiating this expedited due process hearing, which would give your teams that 45 days, up to 45 days of that removal, even though it was a manifestation. And sometimes that may just give us the time and space that we need to create a really strong plan to return that child in 45 days. Okay. On this next slide are several different resources for you. Again, once we take a break at the end here, I'm going to drop in that Google Drive for all of those resources that you may access. Again, I just want to clarify, none of these resources have been vetted by TDOE. So please vet those with your local boards of attorney and your director of schools. I love this threat assessment checklist. It really walks you through for any student what pieces of data you would like to consider. I love the other link here around questions to ask when selecting a training program. If you don't know what your training program is, if you don't have a training program, this may be good for your leadership teams to come together and talk through the questions to ask because there are a lot of different types of protocols out there. There are some specifically made for people with disabilities. There are others that are trauma informed and come with that trauma informed lens. And there are others that are really looking at that criminality side of things. And so you really want to judge and use a program that's going to fit your needs best. That SafeTN link, I hope that all of us know about SafeTN, where folks can make anonymous reports of threats of mass violence. I hope that you guys know that there are QR codes embedded on that website that you can post around your school buildings. If you don't have a centralized location in your communities, I know some schools actually utilize different software programs to collect these data. Others work with their local sheriff's office to have, anonymous reporting phone numbers or QR codes. If you don't have that luxury, certainly use SafeTN. Again, they have QR codes that you can scan and you can post all around all of your central offices, your school buildings for folks to make these anonymous reports. I will say, coupled with that, in the last few minutes that I have, is that at a recent conference, it was a school law conference, and right after my presentation was, and I believe he was the director of Homeland Security in the state of Tennessee, and he was talking around the SafeTN app and taught me many things. One of which was that every single school district in the state of Tennessee has a Homeland Security agent that is willing to come out to your school buildings and talk about threats of mass violence and really truly building relationship and rapport with your faculty, with your staff, with your students, for them to understand the magnitude of what can occur and what will occur when when these threats of mass violences are made. And I just encourage you to reach out to those folks, and you can do that through that SafeTN app and find your agent to invite them out. I know somebody last week said, April, shouldn't we be teaching our kids not to say this? I think whatever yardstick we're holding to punitively provide consequences, we should be proactively teaching them on the front end. So absolutely, making sure our codes of conduct explicitly talk about threats of mass violence, but then certainly having school-wide assemblies where maybe you're bringing out this one of these agents from Homeland Security to talk through what this means for your students, I think is always a great proactive and preventative approach to these threats of mass violences. And then my last little piece here, I know many of you guys in Tennessee know that we've had a number of school shootings in the last few years. And the most recent one out of Metro Nashville, Antioch High School, many of us heard and watched the horrific news coverages where students and faculty were really just telling the world that, goodness, we saw this coming. We saw this coming. If your team see it coming, what are we doing to proactively and preventively approach this? What can we do to intervene on that pathway to violence, to build relationship with these students, to give them an in their communities somehow, some way, to prevent them from getting further and further down that pathway? And so I absolutely hope that we all agree that violence is absolutely preventable in a lot of these cases if we as educators and as school leaders put in these structures into place to make sure that every single student feels safe and welcome in your communities, and that you guys are really implementing a lot of these positive behavioral supports in your schools to try to identify and assess students early, intervene early, and then keep you and your communities and your school communities safe. I'm going to go jump over this feedback slide because that's not for you. But again, this is my contact information. And then Taylor, you have Taylor's email already. Please reach out if you have any questions, and then I will pause and stop sharing my screen so I can drop that Google Drive into the chat for everyone. Thank you so much. And I will actually see you in about 10 minutes for our last session of today.
Thank you so much, April. That was amazing information, so informative. You did get a lot of requests for that webinar that you and Taylor had recorded previously. Is that going to be on the Google Drive, or do we need to upload that to the Special Pops YouTube channel?
I can actually probably drop that really quick. I can pull that out of my inbox and drop that into the chat as well if everybody would like that.
Perfect. That would be great. You got several requests for that. We will also put it on that YouTube channel as well. We're trying to link more webinars that we've recorded there just for offline viewing, or for later viewing, I should say. The only other question that came in that I found, April, was, is there a Tennessee state document that districts should use? I'm assuming that's around the manifestation determination.
There is a state document for MDRs, and that can be found on the TN Pulse site. It could be found under either the 504 page or under the IEP processes page. And so it is not a required template, but we certainly encourage you to use that form because those forms have been vetted by our Office of General Counsel. Your district, though, may determine to use a different MDR form, and that is absolutely your choice. But we do not, on the other side of things, I'm sorry, everybody, I'm blonde and I cannot multitask. So I'm trying to copy and paste this and talk to you. On the threat assessment side of things, no, we do not have a sanctioned threat assessment document. We again encourage you, whatever protocol organization that you are adopting, use what they teach you, okay? Let me see if I can find that MDR training real quick as well. I know I'm encroaching on your break here, so. I'm going to mute for just 1 second because I'm afraid if I click on this link, it's going to open and then you're going to hear me talking in the background just a second. Okay, so that Vimeo is Taylor and I's MDR session. I will say that we recorded this prior to, Taylor, remind me, we recorded this prior to the inclusion of threats of mass violence on state zero tolerance. So there may be some differences in this. We need to get back into the studio and re-record it, but it should get you the information you need now. And we will certainly let you know, administrators, if we re-record that, we can send this out.
Thank you so much, April. I'm going to give you just a minute to catch your breath because I know you're also up next. To answer the question about credit, there should be a survey that will be released at the conclusion of the summit. That will only go to folks who pre-registered, which is also how you will receive your credit for tassel and or attendance. We'd love your feedback either way, but there isn't going to be a feedback survey that goes out to folks who joined without registering. But we so appreciate your participation today.